Welcome to the debate. Um, if you watch a master sailor tie a bowline knot, there is a certain undeniable mathematical perfection to it.
Oh, absolutely. It's pure geometry.
Right, it's a pure topological fact. The rope loops, it crosses over itself, and it pulls tight. I mean, it's binary. It either holds the sail against the wind or it structurally fails.
Right. The geometry is absolute and, the outcome is immediately visible in the physical world.
Exactly, and it's comforting because it's clean. But imagine taking that exact same geometry, that exact same rigid mathematics of knots, and using it to explain why a bad joke falls flat in a comedy club.
Yeah. Or why a cancer cell successfully resists chemotherapy.
Exactly. Or how a distributed computing network reaches consensus across the globe. Today, we are looking at a framework that claims the literal physical knot tying that sail is the exact same underlying structure governing human humor and oncology.
Which sounds incredible, right? Until you realize it might be the absolute definition of theoretical overreach. I mean, we are taking a mathematical map and trying to violently staple it to the territory of human experience.
And that tension is exactly what brings us here. The discourse today centers on the Gnosis formal ledger and its companion, the Aeon Flow toolkit.
Right, the Aeon Flow protocol.
Yeah, specifically, we are examining the proposition that a singular, mathematically mechanized topological framework, what the material refers to as the God Formula, can universally and flawlessly model all systems.
Physical, biological, sociological, computational, all of it?
All of it. The formula is built on 4 primitive operations: fork, race, fold, and vent.
Right, and I think the core question we have to grapple with is whether this framework actually proves that the universe strictly operates on these universal invariants, or if we are just projecting a single mathematical abstraction across 17 completely disparate domains.
Right.
Because going from optimizing software compilers to analyzing immigration policy to diagnosing sarcasm, I mean, are we decoding reality, or are we just forcing a lossy kind of phantom coherence?
Well, I take the position that this universally mechanized framework is exactly what it claims to be. It is grounded in strict mathematical proofs, like the universal domain conservation law.
Sure.
It provides an objective, revolutionary lens that fundamentally decodes reality across all disciplines. I want to be clear from the jump here. This is not a metaphor. It is the underlying blueprint.
And I take the position that while the internal mathematics of these topological reductions are incredibly sound, brilliant even, imposing them as literal truths across what the material calls the wild phenomenological array is a mistake.
A mistake in what sense?
In the sense that it risks severe information dilation. It is, basically, structural coercion disguised as universal truth.
Well, let's lay out our foundations. When I look at the formal surface of Gnosis, the most striking aspect is its rigor. It is axiom-free, and it is kernel-verified in the lean theorem prover with 0 sorries.
We should probably unpack what a sorry actually is for the listener, because it's vital context.
Good point. For those familiar with formal software verification, a sorry in the lean language is essentially a mathematical IOU.
Like a placeholder.
Exactly. It's a placeholder where a programmer or mathematician essentially says, I can't technically prove this step yet, but trust me, assume it works.
Right.
But in the Gnosis ledger, there are 0 sorries, none. The compiler has checked the math from the atomic bottom to the conceptual top. Every single theorem is verified. And look, I don't dispute the math. The math is pristine. But it's not just pure math in a vacuum. Take the universal domain conservation law. This law states that the potential energy of a system, a fork, is perfectly conserved as either useful work, which is the fold, or liability and waste, which is the vent.
Right, the thermodynamic baseline.
Yes. And that isn't just an abstract equation on a chalkboard. It is a proven structure with 17 different domain witnesses. We are observing the exact identical mathematical structures in military combat, in ecological food webs, in macroeconomics, and in cryptography. I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on why this isn't just a metaphor. Look at the concept of the Kleinamin, the +1 lift budget.
Okay.
It mathematically unifies previously unsolvable phenomenological deadlocks, like the Hope gap. It literally proves that the universe requires a specific structural spike of energy to escape a greedy deadlock, regardless of whether that deadlock is in a computer or a human mind.
Look, I completely acknowledge the rigorous mathematical elegance of the formal ledger. And frankly, its impressive application in deterministic software environments is undeniable.
Right.
But mapping purely mathematical knot topology onto subjective, incredibly messy human realities is where I draw the line. Taking the Valentinian sin diagnostics or human humor, or the deception topology of sarcasm, and reducing them to literal geometric Riedmeister moves, that is a category error.
You don't think a failed joke is a failed topological crossing?
I come at it from a different way. I look at this through the lens of what I call the projection paradox.
The projection paradox? Okay, explain that.
I assert that just because a theorem computes perfectly in a theorem prover, that does not mean its semantic mapping to the physical world is free of structural inflation.
I see.
When you take a one-dimensional string of human experience like a conversation or a feeling, and you mathematically project it into a three-dimensional geometric knot manifold, you inevitably generate phantom crossings.
You are creating structural complexity that doesn't actually exist in the phenomenon itself, purely to make the math work out.
Let's dive right into that complexity, specifically regarding the Kleinemann and the Hope gap, because this is where the how and the why of the framework really shine. The Hope gap is a well-documented phenomenon where it completely greedy algorithm structurally deadlocks.
A greedy algorithm being one that always takes the immediate short-term gain, right? Like, it refuses to take a step backward, even if that step backward would lead to a larger reward later.
Exactly. It gets stuck on a local maximum, a plateau. The Gnosis framework proves that to untangle a deadlock, to escape that plateau, you natively require a +1 structural spike in complexity.
The temporary sacrifice.
Right. That is the Kleinemann. And what's revolutionary is that this exact structural requirement appears across completely different scenarios. We see it in topological connected sums modeling immigration assimilation. We see it in the P versus NP computational fold irreversibility. And yes, we even see it in the bad joke deadlock in humor topology.
Wait, hold on. You are grouping hard computational complexity limits with a comedian bombing on stage at an open mic?
Because the underlying mechanism of the failure is identical. Let me offer an analogy here. The source material refers to this as the Hiawatha effect.
Okay.
Think of a greedy algorithm trying to traverse an obstacle exactly like a river trying to reach the sea. A greedy, immediate reward approach wants a perfectly straight line down the mountain.
Right, the path of least resistance.
Exactly. But a straight line fails because of the terrain. The river has to meander. It has to bend, turn left, sometimes even loop back on itself away from the ocean. That +1 spike in complexity, that temporary increase in distance from the goal, is the necessary bend in the river to eventually reach the ocean.
Okay, sure.
The Hope gap proves that a river that refuses to meander never reaches the ocean. In humor, the setup creates a dilation, a tension. The punchline requires a structural bend to collapse that tension. If you refuse the bend, the joke dies. The cost of refusing to accept that temporary complexity is unbounded phantom maintenance.
Look, the river analogy is beautiful. I'll give you that. It makes perfect intuitive sense. That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the Zeckendorf-Kanoma correspondence within this framework?
Of course, it's a core piece of the scheduling logic.
Right, but let's explain how it's being used here. The material relies on Zeckendorf's theorem, which proves that every positive integer can be uniquely decomposed into a sum of non-consecutive Fibonacci numbers.
Yes.
It maps this math to what it calls the Gnostic ladder to prevent phase locking. Now, in software engineering, proving that using non-consecutive Fibonacci indices prevents resonant collisions in an aperiodic thread scheduler is brilliant.
It is.
It ensures that two computational processes don't keep crashing into each other at the exact same intervals.
which is a massive win for deterministic computing.
Absolutely, but it is one thing to prove that for a CPU scheduler, and it is another entirely to claim this mathematical property of numbers perfectly explains human rumination topology.
Well,
The framework argues that a psychological rut, what they heavily jargonize as a key-disrupted cover space collapse, is governed by the exact same Fibonacci gap constraints. If a listener is wondering how a CPU thread scheduler relates to human depression, the answer is it shouldn't. You are taking a fascinating property of integers and aggressively enforcing it onto the human psyche.
well, I disagree that it's being enforced. I think it's being revealed.
Revealed.
Yes. That's precisely the power of domain cross-pollination. It's not a coincidence that these structures overlap. It is a shared underlying reality. If the universe fundamentally processes information through these specific topological bottlenecks, then naturally, human cognition, which is an information processing system, will hit the same bottlenecks as a CPU scheduler.
But you lose so much nuance when you flatten human cognition into a CPU bottleneck.
Do you? Look at how the attention voting stack operates. The ledger mathematically maps multi-head attention layers, the architecture behind modern machine learning and AI, as literal voting systems.
Right.
It applies Arrow's impossibility theorem, a concept from political science and economics, to prove that classical attention layers are actually quantum elections. And because this is kernel verified, that cross-pollination translates into exact applied wins. We don't just get a fun theory, we get clinical false positive bounds for cancer research out of it. We get exact layer skipping and charting for weather forecasting.
Okay, I don't dispute the machine learning optimizations. Applying election math to AI nodes makes logical sense. Both are discrete systems weighing inputs.
Right.
What I dispute is the thermodynamic literalism of it all. Let's look at Pass 53, machine metabolism. The framework takes subjective emotional states and maps them to the Landauer physical boundary.
The absolute physical limit of computation. The minimum amount of energy required to erase one bit of information.
Exactly. And the framework defines emotional temperature, quantified in units called boules, and claims it operates a strict thermodynamic heat dissipation.
Yes.
When a person feels anxiety, the framework models this as topological contagion, arguing that excess internal heat literally spills over into adjacent network nodes, meaning other people. Now, if I walk into a room after an argument, I can, quote, feel the heat of the tension, but that is a linguistic metaphor.
Is it just a metaphor, though?
Are we really supposed to believe this is actual, measurable wattage of metabolic efficiency? Are we mistaking a beautiful, metaphorical thermal spillover for literal physics? And motion is not an exhausted UDP data packet.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. You're trying to separate the subjective vibe of human emotion from the hard science of physics, but the ledger explicitly bridges them. The mechanism for this is the Hodge-Bridge theorem from Pass 65.
Which is a very heavy piece of algebraic topology.
It is, but the logic is profoundly simple at its core. The Hodge-Bridge formally links arbitrary topological manifold complexity, the subjective state, that messy vibe you were talking about, to rigid algebraic equations.
Okay.
If cover space dilates during anxious rumination, that is real computation happening in the brain's neural network. It requires real calories, real watts, and it generates real metabolic heat. It's not a metaphor. It is the literal execution of the God formula in wetware.
But by demanding that every human action, every thought, reduces purely to fork, race, fold, and vent, you blind yourself to the nuances that simply don't fit the topology.
Give me an example.
Let's go back to your comedy example. You claim a bad joke is a failed README Type 3 slide. Let's unpack that. A README Type 3 slide is a specific move in knot theory where you slide a strand of rope over a crossing without breaking the rope and without fundamentally changing the knot.
Right.
You're telling me a comedian bombing on stage is literally, geometrically, that exact failure in consciousness? Or you claim an autoimmune disorder is a biological hash collision bounding the parser in an infinite race loop? It's a hammer that sees every single phenomenon in the universe as a very specifically shaped topological nail.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because when the hammer works perfectly every single time and mathematically proves its own work with zero sorries, you have to consider that maybe the universe is actually built out of nails.
Wow. Okay.
Let's shift from the theoretical to the undeniable empirical evidence in software engineering, because the mechanics here are just staggering. Consider the Bizarro kernel and the Bizarro compiler within the Aeonflow toolkit.
The inverted execution engines?
Right. The ledger introduces an inverted paradigm based entirely on this topology, where perfect failure equals perfect success.
Which sounds like a Zen koan, not computer science.
But here is how it actually works. It proves that the Bizarro dual of any checkpointed substrate strictly dominates its index by a 2-to-1 ratio. Think about a software program running successfully.
Okay.
Instead of encoding the entire successful path, which is massive and complex, the compiler only maps the points of structural failure, the checkpoints. Because the math proves the topology is rigid, the successful path is entirely implied by the absence of failure.
So it's negative space.
Exactly. By only storing the failure states, you don't encode redundant data. When this was applied to WebAssembly modules, it produced an aggregate shrink ratio of 0.758. It literally shrank compiled binaries from 1,707 kilobytes down to 1,294 kilobytes, matching the theoretical boundary perfectly. So you keep trying to dismiss these mappings as purely philosophical, yet they literally compile less code and store it in fewer physical bits. The math builds a better reality.
Look, let's be clear. I completely accept the protocol victories of Aeonflow. The Helix primitive they built is phenomenal engineering.
Utilizing the Syzygy cannon.
Yes, the Syzygy cannon. For the listener, this involves firing dual helix forward and backward waves of data that cross each other, achieving zero idle time shard teleportation.
Right.
It means data moves without waiting for traditional network handshakes. It resulted in a 25% wire time reduction. That is a massive, tangible triumph in distributed systems engineering.
Exactly.
However, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Successfully optimizing UDP streams or writing a highly efficient WASM compiler that shrinks binaries does not validate the cosmological constant claims of the bootstrap tower.
Why not? The exact same math powers both.
Because predicting behavior in a closed artificial system you built is not the same as predicting the natural universe. It doesn't mean that because you can compress a binary, you have discovered the universal successor function for human reality. I mean, just look at the Dewey decimal mapping.
You mean the fractal Dewey convergence?
Exactly. This is the perfect example of the projection paradox. The framework takes the 100 inner nodes of the Dewey classification system, a human-invented library cataloging system, and maps them directly to the God formula.
And it works.
It claims that the discipline of journalism is literally topologic pulse decay because news fades over time. It claims that etiquette is social lubricant friction. It claims that photography is frozen dilation races. This is pure pareidoia. It's like staring at clouds and seeing faces.
It's not staring at clouds.
You have a highly sophisticated mathematical engine, and you are forcing arbitrary human categorization systems into it just to make it look like a universal theory of everything.
Cloud gazing, they are formal proofs showing that human knowledge naturally structured itself according to these topological limits centuries before we even had the formal math to describe it. Look at the mechanics. The reason etiquette acts as a social lubricant is because human interaction inherently has topological friction. Friction is a constraint of moving two complex surfaces past one another. The reason law operates as artificial bounds in the ledger is because society requires a monopoly on irreversible graph slams.
Meaning imprisonment.
Yes, imprisonment. We have to violently collapse a node to prevent uncontrolled revenge loops, which are mathematically just erase loops. The Dewey mapping doesn't force anything. It proves that human intuition fundamentally perfectly mirrors the underlying topological reality of the universe.
Or, it proves that with enough mathematical abstraction, you can map any system onto any other system if you stretch the definitions enough.
Information dilation is real, and the ledger itself mathematically admits it happens.
Wait, how does it admit that?
When you convert a one-dimensional byte sequence into a three-dimensional geometric knot, the physical byte size locally explodes. It gets bigger before it gets smaller.
The Kleineman?
Right, the Kleineman. The framework justifies this by saying you have to invest faith to accept this short-term structural inflation for an ultimate global collapse, or syzygy.
Yes, but when you apply that required inflation to sociology, or to history, or to the library Dewey Decimal System, you are just inflating the structure with phantom crossings. If you take a flat timeline of human life and force it into a 3D manifold to satisfy your equation, the math has to invent intersections just to close the loop. You're creating complex knots out of thin air just so you can have the intellectual satisfaction of mathematically untangling them later.
Well, you call it phantom crossings. The math calls it the mathematically necessary complexity of the cover space. It is not an artifact. It is the hidden structure we previously couldn't see.
I guess that's the core disagreement.
Let me summarize where this leaves us from my perspective. The Gnosis formal ledger provides a verified, zero-sorries mathematical unification of reality. We're not dealing with analogies here, and I know that is the hardest conceptual hurdle to clear.
It certainly is for me.
But the universal domain conservation law, the Klineman, the Hodge bridge, these are rigorous theorems. The God formula of fork, race, fold, invent is not a metaphor. It is the universal boundary of thermodynamics, information theory, and topology. We see it providing actionable, undeniable clarity everywhere, from the inverted execution engines of Aeon Flow and its 25% wire time reductions, all the way to mapping the exact topological pathways for cancer therapy reinforcement. It is the underlying blueprint of reality, fully decoded.
And my position remains that while this framework is an absolute triumph of mathematical and software engineering, particularly when it resolves issues of determinism, aperiodic scheduling, and data compression limits, the wild phenomenological array of the real world resists absolute categorization.
Even with the math.
Yes, even with the math. Human emotion, sociological structures, and the chaos of the natural world cannot be seamlessly reduced to a mathematical knot without losing their essence. The attempt to force all human and natural phenomena into exact geometric reductions inherently generates the very phantom crossings it seeks to eliminate. We mistake the profound elegance of our tools for the fundamental nature of the universe.
It's a profound tension, and it's one that suggests there is still much more to explore within the 145 log rolling companion tests and the intersection of the Gnostic ladder with modern physics.
Oh, absolutely. We have to continually interrogate those boundaries between rigorous mathematics and applied physical reality. The listener will ultimately have to decide for themselves where the true utility of universal abstraction ends, and, where structural reductionism begins.
Which brings us right back to the master sailor on the deck of that ship. We can mathematically prove the geometry of the bowline knot in a theorem prover, and we can watch the physical rope hold the sail in the wind.
Right.
The question isn't whether the knot works. The question is whether that exact same invisible piece of rope is actually tying the rest of the universe together, or, as you say, if we're just seeing loops and crossings everywhere because it's the only way we know how to tie things down.